Over the last few decades, mental health has really lost its humanism. Mental health is so focused on symptoms and signs and side effects and medication and all these things that really don't have to do with the person themselves. And look, there's no doubt these things are important, right? The symptoms of a mental health disorder can be significant, and they also tell you what's really going on. But I think what's lost in all this is that at the end of the day, there's a person there who's trying to live their life. And the truth is that when you have a mental health disorder, it isn't the symptoms that are the worst part of it. That's bad, yes. The worst part about a mental health disorder is that it will crush your dreams. It will crush your soul. Because if you have a condition, whether it's anxiety, depression, it doesn't really matter what the condition is, OCD, schizophrenia. I'll focus on anxiety today, but you can plug any one of those in. The biggest problem with all of these conditions is that it destroys your life. Because if you have these conditions, it makes it very difficult to plan out a life and live life the way you want it to live. If you have severe anxiety, and I've mentioned in my other episodes, there are obviously multiple forms of anxiety, right? There's social anxiety, there's OCD, there's panic attacks, there are just generalized anxiety, which is anxiety about almost anything, right? You just have anxiety pretty much anything you do. And if you have really, really severe anxiety, you really can't do what you want to do in life. And I think that is the darkest part about these disorders. I struggled with social anxiety for a large chunk of my life. I'm fortunate enough that I no longer struggle with it. But when I did, I basically had to put my life on hold. I couldn't do anything that a typical person, or I don't want to say typical, but let's say a person who's not struggling with this, they just sort of take for granted, right? Simple things, even going to the grocery store was difficult for me. And you don't have to have social anxiety for this, right? If you have just general anxiety and getting in the car and driving around or being late to things, or maybe you have an obsessive compulsive disorder, these things make life so difficult. And so what do we do in response is we try to make our life smaller and smaller. We try to make it easier. That, I think, is our mindset. We think to ourselves, all right, I'm going to try to avoid anything that makes me like really uncomfortable. So I'll find a workaround. And that's a temporary solution for something that doesn't actually help you long term, right? Because if you're afraid to go to the grocery store, well, you can only do that so long before you start to really give up parts of your life. You can't go to the grocery store. You can't go to a party. You can't see friends. You can't see your family. Maybe you have such bad anxiety you can't go to work. And if you can't go to work and you can't see your friends, well, how are you supposed to dream? How are you supposed to dream about a future? How are you supposed to think about what's coming next, what you have next in your life, something to look forward to? Because that is part of what gives life hope and what gives life excitement. And if you struggle with anxiety or depression or any of these conditions, you can't feel those things because when you look into the future, there's nothing there. It's a black hole. And thinking about trying to get to the other side is filled in your mind with so many obstacles that it's not even worth thinking about. Right? You're just trying to make it through the day. How are you supposed to plan out where you're going to be in 10 years? Who the love of your life is going to be, what kind of family you want to have, what kind of friends you want to have, what kind of job you want to have, even what do you want to do with your weekend, right? I mean, something so simple that, again, many people take for granted. How can you plan out what you want to do over the weekend if you're too anxious to do anything, right? Let's say if you have agoraphobia, you can't get out of your house. Look, I realize that, again, the symptoms are obviously a huge part of this. This is what is preventing you from doing this, the symptoms, because they're so severe. But again, with the way mental health is viewed nowadays, especially in the medical lens, we don't really see people as people with lives that they're actually trying to live. We just see them as almost like an entity with these symptoms that we try to get rid of the symptoms and hope, okay, now go live a better life. And sometimes the methods that we have now currently are not sufficient. They're not enough to just get rid of the symptoms and now you can go live your life. Because the other thing is you get rid of the symptoms, and this happens with anxiety a lot. I've seen people who they start to feel better in the sense that their anxious symptoms start to subside, and then they don't know what to do with themselves. They almost start to get anxious about the fact that they're not feeling anxious anymore because they've lived their whole life in one particular way. This is the only way they know how to live their life. So it doesn't feel natural to them to have to go about living in this sort of free way. It feels off, it feels different because this is something scary to them, that they don't have to plan every single moment of their day to exist. And they can actually think about a future. And that's scary because now you have to think about potential positive things in your life. And if you're not used to doing that, well, you're going to feel overwhelmed and lost and confused. And I think we really need to hammer home just how much these mental health disorders really destroy our lives. And I think that if we take less of an approach on symptoms and we take more of an approach of think about how your mental health disorder, whatever it is, think about how it is really crushing your dream. And I realize that on paper that might sound really depressing, but I think that there's some hope there. There's a pathway out there. That's something to get frustrated at. That's something to get angry with, not at yourself, right? Like you're not putting these symptoms on yourself, but the symptoms are occurring because of the disorder you have, and you need a little motivation to push past all this. When I was struggling when I was younger with my social anxiety, I didn't really have much of a motivator because, I was a pretty introverted person, so I didn't mind being by myself, but I sort of used that as an excuse to continue to make my world smaller and smaller. Right. And people, again, whether you have a generalized anxiety disorder or OCD or whatever your condition is, you can get sort of comfortable in the place that you're in, as odd as that might sound, right? We get used to certain ways of living and we get comfortable with those ways of living. And we don't really want to shake things up because we're too afraid of what could happen if we try to push past it. We don't want to make it worse, right? We have our little life and we're comfortable with it. We don't want to push the boundaries too much. But I can tell you that that is what is preventing you from really living a full life, because you have created this life with boundaries, with borders, and you can only live in there. And there's all this fantastic stuff that's on the outside that you can't even see because you can't imagine what a life would look like if you didn't have anxiety, or if you could go do this thing that you're really afraid of doing. And I think if we started looking at anxiety and depression and these sorts of things as almost an enemy to our life, then maybe that'll give us a little motivation to try to do something about it. And look, anxiety isn't always an enemy, right? Like sometimes you need anxiety to help you realize what you need to do and to push you and to motivate you. But there is a form of anxiety where you're passing over the threshold from helpful stress, beneficial pushing and nudging, to absolutely freezing you, right? You become paralyzed by the anxiety and now you can't live a full life. And if you are at that stage in your life with your anxiety or depression, or again, whatever you're struggling with, doesn't really matter. You have to start seeing that condition as an enemy. And what you have to start looking at is, this is getting in my way. And I haven't really taken time to think about what I want to do with my life. I haven't really thought about my future because I can't think about my future because I have this thing in the way. And for once in your life, maybe give yourself the opportunity to sit down and think about, well, what the hell do I want to do with my life? Like, what would my life look like if I didn't have to battle anxiety every day? That may be hard to imagine, but just imagine it for a second. Like, what would you do differently if you didn't have to deal with that? Where would you be going? What would you be doing? What would you be planning? What would your future look like? Because I think if we can start to look at life in that way, now we have a motivator. So instead of focusing on, well, how do I cope? How do I cope? How do I mitigate? How do I make my life smaller and safer? Why not think, well, I have this enemy in my life that's stopping me, right? It's like a bully at your office who is putting you down and won't let you elevate to the level you want to get to in your career and in your job. You need to push past them. You need to get past them and not work within their framework. Because if you work within their framework, you're going to feel subdued. You're going to feel boxed in. You're going to feel subjugated. You have to look at anxiety and depression, I think, as an enemy in your life that is trying to crush your dreams. And you want to live out your dreams. You want to do the things that you want to do, obviously. And so But first, you have to figure out what that looks like. What does your life look like unencumbered by stress and anxiety and depression? Now you have a pathway. Now you have something to look forward to. And now you can use that as motivation to start acting against your anxiety. When that anxiety comes in and tells you, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, oh, that's too scary, that'll cause too much stress. You have to look at that and say, hey, I've been telling myself that my whole life, and it's gotten me nowhere, or at least it hasn't gotten me where I want to be. It has made my life so small. It has crushed my dreams, and it's not making me feel any better. And this is what we have to realize about anxiety is that when you push past it, you actually learn, oh, I can handle it. See, you don't know you can handle it yet because you've never really tried. You've never tried to push past that barrier. So you got to find out where your barriers are so you can push past them and you can see that, oh, I can handle it. And then what happens is you start to realize that you actually are someone capable of taking on high stress. And then the stress gets easier to deal with. And then you actually do start becoming less anxious. Part of the reason you're anxious is because you've closed your life in. The anxiety reinforces it. It tells you, no, you're not capable of doing that. So then you convince yourself that you're not capable of doing that. And now that's how you see yourself. You see yourself as this weak, feeble person who can't do difficult things. And you need to prove to yourself that you can do difficult things. And you need to almost put up a middle finger to the anxiety and say, you know what, screw you. I'm going to go do this thing anyway. I'm going to prove to you and to myself that I can live that life that I've been dreaming to live. And I think that this is a more personal way about talking about mental health. I think talking about symptoms isn't, again, it's sort of robotic, right? It's not really understanding the person. And I think sometimes when we just focus on our symptoms, we miss this part. We miss this part of we are not living a life, right? Because of these mental disorders. And it's time that we get that back to ourselves. And the symptoms may not go away immediately, but we almost need to live in spite of the symptoms. And I had to do that with my own social anxiety. I still had social anxiety for a long time, but I just started acting like I didn't. I had to push past these certain boundaries that I'd put in place for myself because I didn't think I could handle it or I didn't think I was ready. And slowly but surely, these things got easier and easier. So these were just some thoughts I had today. I hope you found this helpful. Thanks again for listening in, and I'll see you soon.